Hello, learners, and welcome to this NPTEL course on Victorian literature. As promised, in this lecture, we will continue understanding the context of religious change and the intellectual ferment around the ideas of belief and doubt unleashed by the growing intellectual clout of the natural sciences in the middle of the Victorian era. We have read some excerpts from poems by Arthur Clough, in which the poet quite powerfully mentions that Christ does not rise on Easter Day. Now, that I mentioned is an attempt by the poet to reconcile matters of religious faith with the growing intellectual clout of science. The scientific and biological notion of the human body does not allow for resurrection. Once the human heart stops beating, it is impossible for the human body to become alive again. And that is the question that the poet asks: how does Christ resurrect? This is in some ways a futile activity, in some ways an impossible intellectual challenge, because the poet is demanding a scientifically viable explanation from a religious text. Somewhat more nuanced and somewhat more holistic and somewhat more reasonable attempts at making sense of the difference between faith and doubt can be found in the long epic poem titled In Memoriam. Now, I will not be discussing this poem in greater detail. This course has a module on In Memoriam, and this text will be discussed by my colleague, Professor Smita Jha. However, I will briefly mention In Memoriam to illustrate a key point about how writers made sense of the confusion unleashed by the natural sciences and how it made it difficult for individuals to continue to hold on to religious faith. Now, In Memoriam is a long poem. It was composed between the years 1833 and 1849, eventually published in the year 1850. It is a spiritual autobiography that was occasioned by the death of a friend, that is, Arthur Henry Hallam, a close friend of Tennyson's. That was the occasion, and it consists of 131 lyrics of varying lengths. To understand how scientific writing made its way into this spiritual autobiography and how the metaphor of geology is used to describe the experience of introspection, doubt, and the struggle to move towards certainty, we can read an excerpt from poem 55, in which Tennyson writes, "I falter where I firmly trod, and falling with my weight of cares upon the great world's altar stairs that slope through darkness up to God, I stretch lame hands of faith and grope, and gather dust and stuff." The world's altar stairs, right? The great world's altar stairs. This is an explicitly geological metaphor because geology is about the layers of the earth, quite literally, how as the earth grows, layers develop on the rocks and the soil and the material of the earth, right? So, as a scientist observes the layers in the soil and through these layers calculates the age of the earth, the poet, who is also a spiritual scientist, observes his own process of struggling to find God and describes how he slips, right? While earlier he could firmly trod the great world's altar stairs, now his footing is less firm and he slips. There is a slope through the darkness. Right? The poet stretches lame hands of faith and tries to move towards certainty. By the end of the poem, however, these doubts have been resolved. The narrator has reached a moment of certainty in which he is happy to affirm his faith in God. In the 124th poem, the poet writes, "That which we dare invoke to bless, our dearest faith, our ghastliest doubt, he, they, one, all within, without. The power in darkness whom we guess." So the poet is moving towards faith and affirms that the period of struggle, of trying to find who is one's God, the period of doubt actually makes the process of moving towards certainty that much more valuable, and the resolution that much more worthy of celebration. In the final lines of the poem, these doubts are resolved in these words: that God, which ever lives and loves, one God, one law, one element, and one far off divine event to which the whole creation moves. Right? So, this certainty is achieved only in the very last lines of the poem. As I mentioned, there are more than 130 lyrics, and it takes a lot of time. The writer of these words takes a lot of time and energy to go through this process of doubt in order to arrive at that final moment of faith. While faith is arrived at, it is less certain than it was before. So while there is faith, it is tempered, it is balanced by a great deal of skepticism, by a great deal of logical demands that the basis of religious faith be justified to a logical perspective. Now, we have understood two perspectives. First is the perspective of the clergyman who believed that the Anglican Church had begun to move away from its stated path of pure religious faith and should be fixed by incorporating some visible demonstrations of faith. That is, the Anglican Church should become a little more Catholic. This was the argument put forward by the clergymen as part of the Oxford movement and the Tractarian movement. That was one perspective. This was followed by the perspective of poets who tried to question and strengthen their faith by giving full voice to the logical and skeptical challenges to faith. We have seen Arthur Clough and we have seen Tennyson, open-minded poets who tried to reconcile faith with doubt by describing in careful and detailed manner the kind of doubts and assaults on faith that science enabled. Now, in addition to these two perspectives, there is a third perspective, which was that of the literary heirs of the Oxford and Tractarian movement. This perspective is represented most powerfully in the work of two women writers, Charlotte Young and Christina Rossetti. Young was tutored by John Keble, a dominant voice in the Oxford movement, and Young wrote a novel titled Scenes and Characters, which described in great detail the domestic space of an Anglican household. This novel, Scenes and Characters, was published in the year 1847. 2 years later, in 1849, Tennyson had completed the composition of In Memoriam, and this was the year in which Christina Rossetti happened to compose a poem titled Sweet Death. As I mentioned in my previous lecture, the 1840s were a decade when Christina Rossetti had begun writing poems and committing them to notebooks. Many of these would eventually be published, but in this time they were not yet published. They were written but committed only to private copies. They were not printed or published in book form and were therefore not accessible to the general public. Nonetheless, the fact that this poem was composed and the themes that it addresses place it in an important dialogue with the other religious thinkers of this time. What exactly does Christina Rossetti write about in this poem, Sweet Death? To understand that, let us read the last lines of this poem. Rossetti writes, "Youth and beauty die. So be it O my God, thou God of truth, better than beauty and than youth, are saints and angels, a glad company, and thou, O Lord, our rest and ease, are better than these. Ultimately, then, what is the point of these lines? The point of these lines is that the poet looks forward to death as a moment of great celebration because it represents a spiritual accomplishment. The person who dies, the devoted believer who dies, is reconnected with God. And that connection, that resolution amounts to a long lasting, permanent, and much more valuable state of being than is the somewhat short lived and transitory celebration of youth and beauty that one can experience while one is alive. Additionally, this sort of celebration of death as an occasion of being reunited with one's Maker is a deeply conservative religious idea. It is an embrace of orthodoxy. And the fact that it comes from a precocious, young, extremely talented writer and poet places it in a direct contradiction with the kind of thinking about religion that we have seen in the work of Tennyson and Clough. Here is a writer who uses her literary talents, her literary prowess, not to question faith, not to degrade or remove from faith the intensity of belief, but to create a stronger foundation for religious belief. This is also a very sensitive, creative, and intelligent portrait of belief. It is a highly intellectual and sophisticated account of belief. It does not say that one should become religious simply because someone else says so, but it is a chronicle of a deeply felt experience of faith. The poet who looks forward to death so that she can be reunited with her Maker is no less intellectual than the poet who uses images from geology in order to describe the crisis in his faith. So these are different literary perspectives on the Victorian debate between faith and doubt. And words by Christina Rossetti also give us a different perspective on how literary skill, literary craft, literary form, these are rhyming words, sentences, can be used to explore and create a strong foundation for what may appear to be a deeply conservative idea, but is actually a sincere account of a deeply felt religious experience. And by describing such an experience, the writer is actually providing an intellectual chronicle to readers. In addition to the religious debate, in the 1840s, the women's question also became very important. For many writers, including Sarah Stickney Ellis, women were hailed as domestic female saints. Women became saints of the domestic space, that is the home, through their labor. This was a labor that was domestic in nature. It had to do with sustaining life in the private space. It had to do things like cook and clean, etc., assist in childbirth. It also had reproductive elements involved in it. Producing children, raising children were important parts of women's labor. And also, it was conducted in the domestic space and it contributed to the sustenance and management of domestic space. Many writers questioned this sort of a canonization, notably Charlotte Bronte in Jane Eyre, published in the later half of the 1840s, in the year 1847. The narrator of this novel rails against the lack of education and opportunity provided to women. And so the canonization of women as domestic saints rings hollow when one juxtaposes against it the lack of opportunity in education. This intellectual churn is extremely important and sets the frame for a lot of writing that Christina Rossetti undertook and published. How did Christina Rossetti respond to this growing concern with the women's question? In the 1870s, Christina Rossetti declined to sign a petition. This was a petition from Augusta Webster, a very public figure who wanted to enlist some support for women's suffrage, that is, the right to vote. Women should get the right to vote. This was the point of the suffragist movement, and Christina Rossetti declined to sign that petition. Now, on the face of it, it sounds like an extremely conservative and anti-feminist thing to do. Let us try and understand, however, why Christina Rossetti declined such a petition. Her refusal to sign up to the cause of women's suffrage had a biblical basis. The biblical basis of this was that women are in some way different from men and maybe even subordinate to men. What is the kind of this difference, and why might they be subordinate to men? This was from a belief and from a very strong conviction that women, by virtue of their subordination, imitate Christ's own position through their obedience and patience. So Christ was the ultimate underdog, the underprivileged, powerless, and yet someone who, through his suffering, through his patience, quiet obedience, all meek and passive qualities, gained the power to save humanity and ultimately became the object of faith. For Christina Rossetti, the position of women in Victorian society, in public, as well as inside the Victorian family home, was a little bit like the position of Christ in the society of his time. That is, apparently powerless, lacking the agency to produce real change, lacking material force and strength, but through the capacity to suffer, through the ability to obey, and through the strength of their endurance, patience, and other passive qualities, they could sustain themselves and gain a different kind of authority. So because women already had this kind of authority and agency and power, Christina Rossetti did not believe in signing up for that petition. Now, ultimately, from a 21st century perspective, this position can seem extremely narrow-minded and can even seem ridiculous. Nonetheless, it is our duty to understand the context from which a writer emerges and to withhold our judgment until we can square what they wrote with the kind of world they came from. So let us withhold our judgment of Christina Rossetti's feminism and try and understand her intellectual and emotional power by juxtaposing this position that she took with the words and the ideas that she conveys through the poem Goblin Market. Now, this is a conviction that is present throughout Goblin Market, and we will understand in greater detail exactly how this Christ-like suffering, Christ-like passive force is described and enacted by characters in Goblin Market. The character Lizzie suffers for her sister's sake, and through the suffering is presented in a Christ-like manner, right? This is an important part of Christina Rossetti's views on the women's question, and we will understand this in greater detail when we actually read those lines. For now, let us think a little more about the context and exactly how Rossetti responds to the women's question. In the 1850s and 1860s, Rossetti wrote a lot of poems which touch on the subject of relationships between men and women, romantic love, amatory relationships, and marriage. All of these relationships, marriage, romantic love, etc., are described as dissatisfactory. There is an indirect, oblique, and necessary religious critique of this kind of heterosexual, romantic, marriage-based relationships. Instead, the poems that Christina Rossetti writes focus less on the relationship between men and women, and draw the attention of readers to focus on the spaces within the home where women lived, what women did, the kinds of labor they enacted, and the implications of such an organization, confinement, and management of women to these inner spaces, and the necessity and the pressure that women enact those acts of labor. What were the emotional costs and the spiritual rewards, as well as other possible intellectual consequences of such confinement and labor? That is a question that Christina Rossetti addresses and answers, and is in choosing to focus on this question more than questions of romantic love or marriage. Christina Rossetti demonstrates her place and earns her place in the great tradition of powerful Victorian era writing on the women's question. Now, coming to Goblin Market, let us think a little bit about the context in which it was published. The poem Goblin Market was published in the year 1862 by Macmillan, the publisher, in a volume titled Goblin Market and Other Poems. The cover of Goblin Market featured illustrations by Christina's elder brother, Dante Gabriel Rossetti. Dante was an influential artist and known to be a pioneer as well as a revolutionary artist in Victorian era. He was one of the founding members of the Pre-Raphaelite Brotherhood, a group of painters who challenged existing conventions and painted and drew quite a revolutionary and iconoclastic style of art. Dante was a figure of a great deal of cultural influence and also personal influence. He advised, guided, influenced, and in other ways supported and tried to further the career of his little sister, Christina. This guidance that Dante offered has been studied by a great many scholars, and there are many positions that scholars have taken on this guidance. There is some disagreement about the value of this guidance among literary scholars. It is possible to argue that this guidance was actually useful to the young woman who was too up in her head with composing and writing. It is possible that Christina was too much of a poet and had little sense, little pragmatic or practical sense of negotiating with publishers and other practical or money-related or legal issues. It is also possible, however, that despite needing a little bit of guidance, the guidance that ultimately she got may have been too much or unnecessary. It is also possible that some of the specific changes and edits that Dante Gabriel Rossetti made to Christina's work, ostensibly to help it sell and ostensibly to help her find a publisher and earn from her writing, these changes have been understood today, some of them with the benefit of hindsight, to have actually distorted and made a little bit vague or unclear much of the refinedness and much of the nuances of Rossetti's poems. Now, what were the dominant themes of Christina's writing? The scholar Simon Humphreys provides a list of intellectual concerns which are foremost in Christina's writing. These are the hope of eternal life, the fear of judgment, the temptations of the world, the possibility of harmonizing worldly and heavenly love, the imitation of Christ's self-sacrificial suffering, the necessity of divine grace for salvation, the sacraments administered by the Church, the destiny of unbelievers, the uncertainty of biblical interpretation, the understanding of history in the light of biblical prophecy, and finally, the watchful longing for the return of Christ. Now, Dante Gabriel Rossetti insisted on separating Christina's career into two parts. The first part is a secular and the second is a devotional. Roughly, the secular description maps onto the first two volumes, that is Goblin Market and Other Poems and The Prince's Progress. The later publications are categorized as devotional with the sense that they focus more explicitly and directly on religious concerns. Here, Dante Gabriel might have been influenced by the literary history of canonical British writers like John Donne. However, as Simon Humphreys demonstrates, these intellectual concerns with religion are present not only in the later devotional writings as labeled by Dante Gabriel, but are present in all of Christina Rossetti's writings. It is just that the first two volumes seem to have overt plot summaries that seem to tell non religious stories. However, a closer attention to these works will reveal that everything Christina Rossetti wrote was shot through with an intense religious energy. Religion is less of a theme or a concern or an intellectual debate on which the writer needs to take a position. It is less of these things, and it is in fact more of an animating spirit. Religion creates the foundational form from which Christina Rossetti's writing emerges. So, religion is less a thematic or a debating point, and it is more an animating spirit. Two positions. Let us now think of two positions that Christina took in relation to the imperial occupation of India. The poem In the Round Tower at Jhansi, June 8, 1857, was composed on 8 September 1857 and was first published in the journal Once a Week on 13th August 1859. In the book Goblin Market and Other Poems, this was the second poem in the volume. It was inspired by a news report in the Times newspaper of 31st July 1857. This was an event that was a part of the mutiny of 1857, which began in May. As part of this mutiny, many Indians who were working as soldiers in the British Army rebelled against their white English superiors because they were forced to handle through their mouth cartridges that were greased with the fat of animals. Now, this led to a full-blown rebellion, a war of independence. And as part of this war of independence, there was an incident in Jhansi. One officer named Captain Skeen was attacked, and he decided to do something in response to the attack from the swarm of Indian rebels. In the Times newspaper report, it was mentioned that when this Captain Skeen, when he found himself surrounded and he found that he could not fight off the rebels anymore, he decided to shoot his wife and then himself, a fate that he thought was better than being captured by the Indian rebels. And this essentially is a story that Christina Rossetti also tells in her poem, In a Round Tower at Jhansi. However, on September 11, 1857, the Times newspaper published a correction. The correction was that this officer and his wife were actually captured and then killed. So this story makes the officer look less brave from the perspective of a very particular type of observer. Christina Rossetti published a note declaring that her verse was contradicted and that her words were historically inaccurate. Later in her life, in the year 1880, on 29th July, Christina writes about the imperial occupation of India. In a letter, Christina Rossetti writes, "We have just been reading the terrible Indian news." The news that she refers to was an article, again in that morning's Times, which summarized the report of a commission set up to inquire into the causes of Indian famines. And this described how in the years 1876-78, more than 5 million Indians were killed due to the mismanagement of food and resources by the British government. Reading about this report, Rossetti writes, "I do think our Indian crown is in great measure the trapping of a splendid misery, and how should it be otherwise when so much injustice and bloodshed have, I believe, founded and upheld our rule. All the perfumes of Arabia cannot sweeten this little hand, and the riches and influence of such an empire would be a world well lost, if thus we could learn to do justice and love mercy and walk humbly." Now, this letter demonstrates how concerns with social and political issues are filtered through religious ideas of justice, love, mercy, and humility in the intellectual frame that Christina Rossetti creates. This is an important idea for us to remember when we read Goblin Market, and that's exactly what we will do in the next lecture. The concern with women, the concern with the issues of racial equality, the concern with injustice, the concern with treating all denominations of society equally, all of these concerns are not subordinate to questions of religious faith. Rather, they are accessed through the concern with religion, the true interpretation of the place of Christ in the life and context of a believer. This concern enables Christina Rossetti to widen her intellectual and moral frame in order to access and comment on other issues of gendered, social, and racial equality. We will understand how more of this concern animates Christina Rossetti's work, and we will understand how, in addition to religious debates, there are important intertextual connections as well, and chiefly the influence of John Bunyan's book, The Pilgrim's Progress, and the Bible, specifically Revelation 18, exert very important shaping influences on Goblin Market. We will continue this discussion by briefly understanding what John Bunyan and Bible do for Christina Rossetti, and also begin reading the text, Goblin Market, in the next lecture. Thank you.